Welcome to the IDP Plus Advice Show. Today we're going to look at Week 8 IDP snap counts, defensive player alignments and positioning. We're going to talk about some injuries, some trades that happened shortly before recorded, and resulting waiver impacts and trade targets, etc. I am your host, Ricky Rodrigue. You can find me on X at RickyRod66. I am coming to you from a hotel room as I'm traveling right now, but I didn't want to leave you all hanging. So this may not be as smooth as normal, but hopefully you'll work with me, and the content that you're looking for will be the same. Unfortunately, too, my partner Shawn Teague, he once again had children's school sports activities, so Shawn can't join today. But I am thrilled to be with y'all here on Tuesday, October 28th, recapping Week 8 and looking ahead towards Week 9. Of course, you can always leave your comments and questions on this YouTube Plus IDP Advice Show, and Shawn and I will be responding to them and looking at those comments and questions, etc. And always appreciate a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. All right, let's jump into this, everybody. And we're going to start off with the Buffalo Bills here in the AFC East. And I am going to be recording timestamps, so work with me as we go through this. Of course, one of the bigger things that happened with the Buffalo Bills as we look forward is Ed Oliver, the stud defensive tackle, just recently returned from injury, got injured again, pectoral situation, most likely out for the year. So bad news for the Bills and for those in defensive tackle required leagues that were using Ed Oliver, and we'll have to look somewhere else for his replacement. But the even bigger news was the BS move that the Bills made by making Terrell Bernard active. Matt Milano was inactive before the game, at least we knew that. But it wasn't announced till after the game started, which was a surprise to everyone, that he was only available, he being Terrell Bernard, in case of an emergency. So as a result of that, those people that played Terrell Bernard got absolutely jobbed. Okay, that's the best word I could come up with right there. And Shaq Thompson ended up wearing the green dot and playing that role in Milano's place, and Dorian Williams played more of the Milano role. Now, Buffalo, I didn't mention at the beginning, did play 61 snaps in the game against Carolina, so that was a little bit on the low side. We're going to have to watch practice reports a little bit more carefully this week with a keen eye towards, is Terrell Bernard listed as a full participant and not just a limited participant? And that could make a big difference in terms of what happens this coming week in terms of usage. Taylor Rapp, going to the secondary, was placed on injured reserve. Jordan Poyer, who I talked about on last week's show, was elevated from the practice squad for the game on Sunday. It started in Rapp's place, and in fact, today was signed to the 53-man roster of the Bills. Poyer played 76% of his snaps close to the box, which was bad news for Cole Bishop, as a side note. But Poyer is 34, not someone we're necessarily relying on. I'd even talked in previous shows how Rapp and Bishop were both struggling. Well, Rapp getting injured and put on IR allowed the Bills to move to Jordan Poyer. I'm not chasing Jordan Poyer, folks, but if in deep leagues and you get to some of the bye weeks coming up where there's 4 teams out, maybe you need him, but he's someone I'm not necessarily chasing. Okay? I also want to say that this game against Carolina was a bit of a blowout, and there are so many games that became a blowout. Some didn't happen to the fourth quarter, where some from the beginning of the game were complete blowouts. Had a significant impact on defensive snaps played by multiple teams and also on the IDP stats as a result to many of our players, and we'll talk about several of those as we go through here. Miami is an example where in their game against Atlanta, as we move to the Dolphins, only played 50 snaps this week. The edge position, Jalen Phillips, again, had a big difference between his snaps and the rest of the edge players, playing 80% of the snaps. Bradley Chubb only played 62%. He was also dinged up as well. The Dolphins play the Ravens on Thursday night coming up, and Bradley Chubb was a did not practice on Monday. Moving to the secondary, Minka Fitzpatrick got banged up during the game. Ifeatu Melifonwu started next to Minka, surprisingly, after it was Ashton Davis the week before. He got dinged up. Ashton Davis got dinged up with a quad injury. Minka is supposed to be fine for Thursday night's game against Baltimore, and with Lamar Jackson coming back and with Minka playing a lot of his snaps in previous weeks close to the line of scrimmage, I think I'm still good playing Minka, but stay away from Ashton Davis, stay away from Melifonwu. We do want to check the practice reports before Thursday night's game just to make sure there's no uh, unfortunate change in Minka Fitzpatrick's situation. But as of now, Minka should be playing, and I would be comfortable playing him. All righty, moving to the New England Patriots, who, once again, low snap count, only played 54 snaps against the Cleveland Browns. Now, remember, as we've talked about on previous shows, but maybe for some of the new viewers, right now, about 65 snaps, give or take, is about the average for a team defense in a given game. So 54 would be extremely low. Now, at the linebacker position for the Patriots, Robert Spillane, 100% of the snaps played. And while last week there was 5 different players that played 35% or less of the snaps, this week Christian Ellis jumped all the way back up to 72% of the snaps, whereas Jack Gibbons played 28%, Jelani Tavai 22%, Marte Mapu played 2%. So we've talked about it before. Christian Ellis has defensive line eligibility on sleeper, and if he's back to this kind of snap count, that could be good news for him, and you can feel a little bit more comfortable playing him after last week where we had to recommend against playing him, given him that he was back into the 30% snap count range, and you just really can't rely on that for IDP productivity at such a low range, even as a linebacker being defensive line eligible like he is on sleeper. Other news today, the New England Patriots traded Kyle Duggar to the Steelers, so we'll talk about that when we get to Pittsburgh. And they also traded Keon White to the San Francisco 49ers, and we'll talk about that when we get to San Francisco. But I wanted to call out those trades in case you hadn't seen those yet. Duggar wasn't going to get any more playing time, and he just wasn't seen as a great fit in New England. Jalen Hawkins returned from injury this past week, and he and Craig Woodson played essentially 100% of the snaps at safety. So there you have it, folks. That is your New England Patriots safety position. Also, as a side note today, Marcus Jones got a contract extension from the Patriots of 3 years today. Their slot/nickel cornerback, who also returns punts, was very valuable to the Patriots, and they have gone ahead and extended him. So that is the New England Patriots story. Moving on to the New York Jets, who only played 59 snaps against Cincinnati. So if you look at it, every AFC East team played less than your typical 65 snaps. So on the Jets side of things, once again, a big surprise that was not announced in advance of the game. Jamian Sherwood, who's been one of the top linebackers for IDP this year, was benched to start the game. And once he was benched, there was no clear information about would he come into the game. They sat him the whole first quarter, and then he came in to start the second quarter and basically played the rest of the game, all the snaps in the rest of the game. Still no information that I've seen at this point in time yet about why he was benched, but the fact that they put him in after the first quarter and he played the rest of the game seems like there was something, maybe some sort of rule violation of some sort. There's a little bit of a penalty, and as a result, Kiko Mawagoa got to stay in the lineup because Quincy Williams was also activated from the injured reserve list, and he was last week. He was activated from the to practice from the 21, and he had the 21-day window. He immediately went basically into a full-time role. Mawagoa played that first quarter, and then as soon as Sherwood came in, Mawagoa went out. So what does that mean? Bye-bye, Kiko. He is no longer of value, and you can drop him for other needs. If you could potentially stash him for a Sherwood or Quincy Williams injury situation. Maybe he'll get those snaps back. But once again, he wasn't exactly lighting up the IDP scoreboard with stats. So Kiko, you can move on from. Moving to the secondary, Malachi Moore played 100% of the snaps at safety. As one of the starters again this week, he played 66% of those snaps deep, so he played a much deeper rate than he did in the game the previous week. Andre Cisco was basically full-time until he got injured. That meant Tony Adams returned to the lineup. Still no word yet on the severity of Cisco's injury. Usually if it's a significant injury, word often comes out pretty quickly. And right now, haven't heard anything. Leads me to believe this is more day-to-day, worst case, week-to-week. He could be at risk for this coming week. I would not be picking up Tony Adams to play in his absence. Now, I do have to do a caveat with me traveling, but still want to do a show. I didn't get a chance to study all the buys for this coming week. So I'll go back and I have a tab open. I just didn't memorize them all. So we'll talk about the buys here a little bit later in the show. Okay? Let's move to the AFC North in the Baltimore Ravens. They played 63 snaps against the Chicago Bears. Mike Green, his snap count was all the way up to 83%. So the second-round rookie from Marshall, who many people thought should have gone in the first round, but there were some off-the-field alleged allegations. And as a result, he dropped to the second round. But he's up to 83% of the snaps. He did get a sack, but according to PFF, shout out to PFF, his pass rush grades still aren't close to where they need to be. So great that he's getting the snaps. But particularly in heavy scoring, big play, heavy scoring systems, it's going to be hard to trust him until we see improvement in the pass rushing skills / win rate. Kyle Van Noy played 64%. David Ajobu played 48% of the snaps. Those were basically your three edge players this past week for the Ravens. And that looks like what it's going to be the rest of the year since they traded Odafe Oweh. There might be someone from the practice squad that calls up that gets like 10 or 20% of the snaps to have a fourth edge. But these are going to be your three. And right now, I'm not feeling great about any of these, even Kyle Van Noy, because he's up there in age. And the type of sack production he had last year, we're just not seeing yet at this point in time. Moving to the linebacker position, Roquan Smith returned and played 100% of the snaps. A big change, though, Teddy Buchanan was all the way down to 70% of the snaps. Trenton Simpson did pick up 16% of the snaps, folks. But what Baltimore did is that Kyle Hamilton essentially played no deep snaps. Everything was close to the line of scrimmage. And once again, for those that are new, when I talk about close to the line of scrimmage, they either played in the box, played in the slot, or played along the defensive line. So Kyle Hamilton had all 100% of the snaps in that kind of alignment, nothing from a deep safety perspective, nothing from an out wide perspective. That's great positioning for him. And if that continues, that'll be great for Kyle Hamilton's productivity. Alohi Gilman and Malachi Starks also both played over 90% of the snaps, with Gilman at 99%, Malachi Starks, the rookie from Georgia, at 92%. So coming back to full circle, back to the linebacker situation, they played a lot of three safeties with Kyle Hamilton close to the box. My concern right now is that Teddy Buchanan, that 70 to 75% range, may become more the normal, as opposed to the snap counts that we're starting to see before Roquan got hurt, while Roquan was hurt. Now he could be in that, he being Buchanan, could be in that 70, 75% range, which would certainly hurt his IDP stats. So something to keep an eye on. And depending on your other options as we move forward here into future weeks, you may want to look at other options for this coming week in place of Teddy Buchanan, particularly against the Dolphins, who, as a side note, do not give up a lot of points to linebackers in general. So just another tidbit of information for you to consider related to Buchanan, and do you play him or not. Moving to the Bengals, who played 72 snaps against the Jets on defense and somehow managed to give away that game against the Jets. Big news on the defensive line. Trey Hendrickson was back. We talked about it in the Start Sit show on Sunday morning, which, by the way, I'd encourage you, if you haven't been joining, you should join, because there's always some interesting tidbits that come up. And one of the things that Shawn and I talked about was that Trey Hendrickson was a big risk with this back/hip situation. And if you played him, you're taking a big risk. And sure enough, as we discussed and talked about, he left after playing only 32% of the snaps and basically getting limited IDP stats for you, and he re-aggravated that back/hip injury. So if Hendrickson is active again this coming week, because they're calling him day to day, once again, I think it would be quite risky to put him into your starting lineup. With that being said, Miles Murphy ended up leading the edges in snaps with 78%, with Joseph Osai second in snap percentages for the edge, but we're not playing either one of those guys. It's Hendrickson or bust along the edge for the Cincinnati Bengals. At the linebacker position, the movement towards youth continues, with Barrett Carter playing 100% of the snaps, Demetrius Knight playing 88%, Logan Wilson down to 28%. I know we've talked about potentially dropping Logan Wilson, particularly depending on your situation, or if you can if you can afford to hold him just a little bit longer until we get through the trade deadline on November 4th, which is next Tuesday. I believe 4 o'clock Eastern is the deadline. Maybe it's 5 Eastern, but somewhere next Tuesday afternoon. If he isn't traded by that point, then you can certainly drop him. But right now, you certainly can't play him at only 28% of the snaps. Moving to the Cleveland Browns, who played 68 snaps against the New England Patriots. Myles Garrett, incredible game with 5 sacks. Just a monster and a beast. And I know sometimes people get frustrated when he doesn't have any sacks or big games. And I know there was a couple of games earlier where he didn't have any sacks and just a couple of tackles, and people were getting a little bit frustrated. But this is why you can't afford to bench the Myles Garretts. You can't afford to bench the Michael Parsons. You can't afford to bench T.J. Watts. Because when they really go off, they can really go off, as Garrett did with 5 sacks. And if you're in big play scoring leads and you didn't win with Garrett, boy, the rest of your team must have been really hurting otherwise. I actually picked up Alex Wright in the Kings Classic League because while I've made fun of him and Shawn and I have teased about him, he's continued to improve. And, of course, when you have a Myles Garrett doing like he did, it created great opportunities for Alex Wright, including 4 tackles and a sack as well on 66% of the snaps. Now, what's interesting, there are rumors that Alex Wright is a potential trade target for many teams. I sure like him staying with the Browns across from Myles Garrett. But let's say he ends up with the Detroit Lions across from Aiden Hutchinson. I wouldn't necessarily hate that either. So let's see if he gets traded. Let's see where he ends up. Let's see if he gets traded. But in the meantime, Alex Wright is moving into the number 2 defensive end / edge, number 2 defensive end type / edge type of player for us, with the continued improvement in productivity and IDP stats. At linebacker, the big news, Carson Schlesinger was playing late in the game when the game was basically a blowout, by the way, and he got hurt. And he has a high ankle sprain, which they're saying is not a serious high ankle sprain, but a high ankle sprain is serious. Okay, maybe nothing's broken or whatever, but he's going to be out at least 4 weeks, if not potentially 6 weeks. That's a real problem. I was surprised that, of course, we've talked about Devin Bush and how in previous shows, I'll come back to the surprise in a second, but Devin Bush, you can continue to play him, particularly now with Schlesinger out. You're definitely going to continue to play him. We've talked about that in previous shows. But the surprise was that I thought maybe Jerome Baker would be the 3rd linebacker that would come in, and it would be Bush and Baker. But it wasn't. It was actually Bush and Mahmoud Diabate who ended up being the 2 linebackers as Schlesinger was out. And it's similar to something we're going to talk about in San Francisco, but Jerome Baker has been that number 3 linebacker next to Schlesinger and Bush when they went to 3 linebackers. But when one of those others are out, as it turns out, it looks like Diabate is the favorite for either that Mike or Will linebacker position, whereas Jerome Baker is more favored as the Sam, which is the 3rd linebacker, the strong side linebacker, the Sam. And that's why he appears not to be the one to rely upon. And with Schlesinger out at least 4 to 6 weeks, Diabate is someone that both Shawn and I think are targetable. And by the way, while Shawn couldn't join the show, and you can follow Shawn at Shawn8386 as a side note if I didn't mention that earlier, but Shawn did send me his notes and thoughts as well, and I compared them with mine, and both he and I are aligned on Diabate as someone that you can pick up and play And I would expect about 80 to 85% of the snaps is my guess. And on this Cleveland Browns team, I think that's playable with Diabate. Okay, moving on to the Pittsburgh Steelers now, folks. They played 64 snaps against the Green Bay Packers. And let's start with the edge position. But there's a lot to talk about the Steelers. TJ Watt played 92% of the snaps. Alex Highsmith, 73%. Nick Herbig, 38%. So, second week in a row that we see Herbig in the 30% range. We see Highsmith in the 70 to 73% range. And we see Watt over 80%. That looks like what we're going to see going forward. Herbig is basically a stash at this point. He's a great stash, but unless we see an injury to Watt or Highsmith going forward, it's going to be hard to play Herbig. So, or you can't really play Herbig, to be honest with you. So that he's a stash right now. Is Herbig. We play Watt. We play Highsmith. Even though remember Highsmith is coming back from that ankle injury. And it's been a couple of weeks. I expect that we see Highsmith start taking off from here on out as the year progresses. I still think he wasn't 100% from that ankle injury, but the more that time passes from that ankle injury, even with him playing about 70+% of the snaps, I think we're going to see Alex Highsmith returning to the Alex Highsmith, the number 2 type of defensive end/edge that we need and what we drafted for. Okay, moving to the linebacker position. Patrick Queen played his typical 100% of the snaps. Peyton Wilson played 67% at the second linebacker spot. He alternated with Cole Holcomb, who played 33%. But of course, once again, it is hard to play Peyton Wilson even at 67%, part one. Part two is we've seen so much rotation between these two, so that next week you could see a situation where Holcomb plays maybe 60%, Peyton Wilson plays 40%, or something along those lines. 4 teams on bye, maybe you play Peyton Wilson, take that chance in deeper leagues if you're desperate, but it is a bit of a risk. Now, the one thing about Peyton is during the snaps he has been playing, he has been efficient from a tackle perspective in terms of percent of tackles per snap. So that has been good for Peyton Wilson. That's the one thing that potentially gives you a chance to play him in depending on the deepness of your league. At the safety position, DeShaun Elliott was injured during the game, and surprisingly, Chuck Clark actually started the game next to him. Clark seemed to have moved into the DeShaun Elliott role as the game progressed and when DeShaun Elliott went out with injury. And we saw some Juan Thornhill, we saw some Jabril Peppers in the game as a result. But then, as I alluded to earlier during the New England Patriots discussion, Kyle Duggar was acquired by the Steelers today. What is Kyle Duggar's strength? It's not necessarily in pass coverage. He is more of a box safety closer to the line of scrimmage. That is more of his strength. That is the role DeShaun Elliott was playing. So now all of a sudden, Kyle Duggar has extremely great value going forward as he takes over the DeShaun Elliott role. And DeShaun Elliott's injury was described by one report as a hyperextended knee, and another report that said he could be out for the rest of the year. Not sure which of the two it is right now, to be honest with you, as we're recording here on the Tuesday night, just a couple of days after the game. We'll learn more as the week progresses. But as of now, at least for the next several weeks, if not longer, Kyle Duggar, I expect to move into the DeShaun Elliott role. Caveat, this first week coming up this Sunday, because he's just joining the team, I don't expect him to immediately jump into that role. I think he's going to have to learn the system, learn the defensive calls and signals, blah, blah, blah. And so maybe not this Sunday, but the following Sunday is when I think we see more of Kyle Duggar on the field. Okay. Last thing I want to mention, well, 2 more things actually. The Steelers also tried out Von Bell and Eddie Jackson, 2 venerable veterans at the safety position. That actually happened before the Kyle Duggar trade was announced later this evening. Do they potentially still maybe sign Von Bell or Eddie Jackson even to the practice squad? It's a possibility. But I think with the trade of Duggar happening, I think those 2 are now on the back burner. And unless another injury happens, I don't think we hear anything about Von Bell or Eddie Jackson with the Steelers. The second point I wanted to make when I said I had 2 final points about Pittsburgh to make And that is Cam Hayward actually played 83% of the snaps in this game against Green Bay. So while Shawn and I were talking earlier this year how we were kind of getting worried about Cam Hayward and his age and his productivity, at 83% of the snaps for an interior defensive lineman, he can generate some IDP statistics for our team. So he's probably a number 2 defensive tackle / interior defensive lineman at this point in time. Not a number 1, but a number 2. If he continues to play these kind of snaps, creates those opportunities that we want, and that gives us a chance to play him. Alrighty, that wraps up the AFC North, and we're going to move to the AFC South. The Houston Texans against San Francisco only played 48 snaps. 48 snaps. You're not going to get much IDP productivity on 48 snaps when the usual game is about 65. At linebacker, Aziz Al-Shahir played his typical 100% of the snaps. But once again, this week, Henry To'oTo'o and EJ Speed split the snaps at the second linebacker position. To'oTo'o 52%, EJ Speed 50%. With that kind of usage, folks, we cannot play To'oTo'o, we cannot play Speed. So they have to remain on the bench unless one of those clearly grabs hold of the position, and right now that doesn't appear to be happening. In the secondary, we had Kalen Bullock playing his typical almost 100% of the snaps with a big chunk of that at deep safety. Last week, Jalen Petrie played basically 100% of the snaps with the primary starting strong safety, and then when he moved to the slot, that's when MJ Stewart came into the game, and he played in the 50% range. Sorry, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head. What that means is, in this game, though, Jalen Petrie played 96%, and MJ Stewart also played 96% of the snaps. So, once again, if Houston is playing a team that plays a lot of 3 wide, Petrie is going to move into that slot, and you can see MJ Stewart getting near 100% of the snaps. That gives you a chance to play MJ Stewart if you're in a desperate situation with injuries or with buys, etc. You can maybe sneak him in, but your expectations have to be low on MJ Stewart. He is a journeyman safety. Okay, he is a pro football player. He is an NFL professional. I get it, but he doesn't put the type of stats together that we need. So desperate situation, you go to MJ Stewart, but once again, only if Houston's playing a team that plays a lot of 3 wide. Okay, that's really the story about Houston. Danielle Hunter, I'll throw this in as well. He's been disappointing from IDP stats. His PFF pass rush grades have been fairly good, but it's still not translating quite yet. So it's Will Anderson clearly over Danielle Hunter at this point in time, though it's hard for me to shy away from playing Danielle Hunter unless I really have some other solid options to play. Moving to the Colts, another blowout game. But while it was a blowout game, the blowout game happened very early, and while the snaps were 71 snaps for the Colts defense, players like Zaire Franklin, players like Nick Cross, players like Cam Bynum basically sat out almost the whole fourth quarter. So Zaire Franklin only played 62% of the snaps, and on top of that basically only gave 2 tackles. Jermaine Pratt, who played only 48% of the snaps, gave us 8 tackles. Now that's combined tackles, but still. So it was about 10 snaps less for Pratt, but 6 more tackles. Zaire Franklin, I don't know how to say it, continues to be a huge disappointment. I actually sat him in one of my favorite dynasty leagues, the Dyer's Dynasty League, and actually played Tatum Bethune over him. And I am so glad that I did, as I believe Bethune had 14 total tackles. So don't be afraid, even if you picked him in one of the early rounds, sometimes it's time you got to let go. And right now, Zaire Franklin, I'm not saying to completely release him, but when I say let him go, put him on the bench until things change. Now, remember, he also had off-season ankle surgery. He missed a lot of the preseason and training camp. And is it a question of he doesn't understand or is still not in full lockstep with the Lou Anarumo defensive system? I don't think it's the understanding of the system issue. I do think the ankle injury is part of it. I just don't think that he's probably as mobile as he would like to be, part one. But if you think about Logan Wilson, who played the same type of role in Cincinnati, where Logan Wilson was getting a lot of his stats weren't necessarily by racking up 15 tackles every week or 14 tackles every week. It came from a combination of some tackles, like maybe 7 or 8, but there was oftentimes a pass defense or an interception or a forced fumble or fumble recovery. That was Logan Wilson. Zaire Franklin is not getting as many tackles. He was getting less than like the Logan Wilson was in the system. And on top of that, he's not creating big plays as well. So maybe there's someone you can get a trade for. And remember, he's in that age 30 range as well. So particularly in dynasty leagues, well, you'd probably be selling low right now. But if he has a good game, he is actually someone I'm probably attempting to trade. I mentioned Pratt had 48% of the snaps. Austin and JK was the third linebacker, just as an FYI, with 44% of the snaps. Remember, they've let go of Cam McGrone. They've let go of Joe Bacci. Joe Bacci signed with Tennessee, as we talked about last week, or either last week's show or starts it. I forget which one it was, but it was one of the two. So anyway, Austin and JK with McGrone gone and with Bacci gone is now the number 3 linebacker with the Colts in case something happens to Franklin or Pratt. Moving to Tennessee, it was a blowout. As we talked about, because they played Indianapolis. It was the other side of that game. They only played 53 snaps on defense. Cody Barton continues to be Cody Barton, and you've got to be able to find something better, even though he continues to play 100% of the snaps. Cedric Gray continues to do a very nice job in that number 2 linebacker role, and someone we're going to continue to trust because of his tackle efficiency. Moving to the safety position, a rotation continued. Now remember, this was a blowout, but you still saw people like Cody Barton and Cedric Gray basically playing 100% of the snaps. But at the safety position, Monty Hooker, 74% of the snaps. Quandre Diggs, 57%. Xavier Woods, 47%. Kevin Winston Jr., the one I've kind of mentioned a few times on this show now, was all the way up to 40%. But I was worried that with Woods potentially being out, that Winston would move in and it'd still be this ugly 3-person rotation at safety for Tennessee. It became even worse in that it became a 4-person rotation at safety for the Tennessee Titans. That is just not good until they do something different and truly have 2 of these folks playing basically 90+% of the snaps. You can't risk playing any of these 4 in your starting lineups, folks. You're just asking for trouble from an IDP scoring perspective. At the cornerback position, Roger McCreary was traded to the Los Angeles Rams. I'll talk about the Rams a little bit later. So the 3 starting cornerbacks for Tennessee Titans, particularly also with L'Jarius Sneed now also being on IR. You have Jalen Armour-Davis, you have Darrell Baker, and you have Marcus Harris. Truly household names. But at cornerback, you don't need to be a household name to be a high scorer for IDPs. Darrell Baker could be very picked on and could end up being last year's Jalen Jones for the Indianapolis Colts, who was their best choice for a number 2 cornerback with the Colts last year was Jones. But he got picked on savagely, and with that, he did get a couple of interceptions and a lot of pass breakups and a lot of tackles because he's a willing tackler. Could Darrell Baker be doing that in the second half of the year? It's something to watch for. We're not going rush and pick up any of these guys for our rosters, but just something I want y'all to keep an eye on. And remember, in addition to trading Roger McCreary to the Rams, they previously traded Jarvis Brownlee to the Jets. And I didn't bring this up in the Jets, but I will bring it up now. Michael Carter II did return from injury, from his concussion with the Jets. And Sauce Gardner was out. Okay, now here comes the but. Azaria Thomas played on the outside in place of Sauce Gardner, along with Brandon Stevens on the outside. While Michael Carter was back, he didn't play the slot position as he typically did. Jarvis Brownlee played the slot position ahead of Michael Carter. There is also discussion of Michael Carter being on the trade block. Something to watch if Michael Carter gets traded to a team that will use him regularly in the slot position. But for now, Brownlee is the person for the Jets, if you want to know who the slot cornerback was, at least from this past game. And based on the usage, I would expect it to continue, not to mention based on the trade rumors related to Michael Carter. Okay, that is Tennessee with a little bit of a Jets rewind. Jacksonville was on bye this past week, so nothing to talk about in Jacksonville other than the fact that we haven't heard yet if Devin Lloyd will be returning from his calf injury. So, particularly if you have waivers on Wednesday night, I know some people dropped Ventrell Miller going to the bye week and expecting Lloyd to be back. Depending on the practice reports on Wednesday, be on the lookout for Ventrell Miller as someone that you might want to pick up, particularly if Devin Lloyd is a DNP on Wednesday. So that's number one. Number two is some people might have dropped Travon Walker because his stats were terrible going into the bye. Now remember, Travon Walker has been playing with that club because he had that wrist injury that required surgery. He put on a club, but he's only been playing about 25% of the snaps. I'm not saying you're ready to put Travon Walker back into your lineups, but what you can do is if someone dropped him, put him on your bench, and when he gets rid of that darn club and his wrist is back to normal, you could have a real steal here at middle of the year that someone could really boost you on the edge position as a number 2 defensive end / edge. So those are the couple of things I wanted to mention on the Jaguars. Moving to the AFC West, let's look at the Kansas City Chiefs, who had a blowout game. It became a blowout late in the fourth quarter against the Washington Commanders, but they only played 53 snaps in that entire game. You had folks like Nick Bolton, Chamari Connor, etc., missing a big chunk of the fourth quarter. With that, Bolton only played 87% of the snaps, as did Drew Tranquill. 87% of 53, folks. That's in the 40 range from a total snap perspective. We want to see 63, 65, 62 snaps. It is hard to put up IDP stats on 40-plus snaps. So that's your Bolton and that's your Tranquill. But that's also a risk with these defensive players for the Kansas City Chiefs. The way the offense for the Chiefs is really humming, they're moving the ball up and down the field. They're taking a lot of plays to do it, and they keep on scoring. And this is going to continue. The offense is going to continue to rise unless there's some injuries, which is going to have this impact on the Chiefs' defense and on these IDP players. So that is the risk when you play the Nick Boltons of the world, or the Chamari Connors of the world, or the Drew Tranquills at this point in time. Brian Cook, by the way, did get injured during the game. He only played 57% of the snaps. Jaden Hicks played a nice 74%. So we're seeing, he was basically the replacement for Cook between the injury and then the late fourth quarter blowout snaps, for lack of a better term. If Cook is out, I think y'all know who, if y'all been watching this show, I love some Jaden Hicks. So keep an eye on Jaden Hicks if Cook is out and is someone potentially you could play. But once again, it could be a little bit of a gamble if the Chiefs' offense is doing so well and the Kansas City defense is just not on the field that much. The Los Angeles Chargers only played 49 snaps against the Minnesota Vikings and the crippled Carson Wentz. When you heard the injuries that came out today about Carson Wentz and with the shoulder, he had 2 different injuries. He was playing with a torn labrum and a dislocated shoulder, I believe, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. To try and play through that shows a lot of moxie, shows that he really wants to keep a job in the NFL, but it became too painful, and he got placed on IR, undergoing surgery, and he's out for the year. But he played so bad, and the Minnesota offensive line also played so bad that the Chargers' defense was only on the field for 49 snaps. Now, Deion Henley only played 80% of the snaps as a result of the quasi-blowout game. 80% of basically 50 snaps and 40 snaps. You're just not going to get the stats. Just like we talked about on Nick Bolton, you're not going to get those IDP stats on 40-ish snaps in a game. That's part one. Part two, I mentioned in the Start Sit show on Sunday that when I was watching the game, Deion Henley wasn't between the tackles as much. I noticed him more in like a will position, like on the outside linebacker, as opposed to between the tackles on several of the snaps. Now, how big of an impact that had too, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. But Henley and Zaire Franklin have been 2 of the biggest disappointments this year. And if you have other options besides Henley, I'm not opposed to sitting Henley if you need to, depending on how deep rosters are and who you have available, folks. So don't be afraid to sit him, even though you may have drafted him high, expecting a big year, just like we did Zaire Franklin. Denzel Perriman played 47% of the snaps. Troy Dye played 49% of the snaps. On the defensive line, Justin Eboigbe, who we talked about, I believe it was a couple of shows ago, if not the last two shows, played 63% of the snaps, the most by far of the interior defensive linemen. Everybody else was about 50% or less. So Eboigbe is continuing to stand out, and he came through with 2 sacks for us this week. The second-year player from Alabama is really standing out in interior defensive line position required leagues. If you look at his stats over the last several weeks, he's getting tackles or sacks, tackles or sacks. He's really paying off. And for this position, if he is on your waiver wire, go get Justin Eboigbe, folks. All right? In the secondary, Derwin James got injured earlier in the game. I believe he played 12% of the snaps, which I believe was 8 snaps, if I remember correctly at the top of my head. With that, what we saw was Elijah Molden ended up playing 88% of the snaps, R.J. Mickens 74%, Tony Jefferson 25%. Now remember, this was a bit of a blowout as well against Minnesota. And with that, particularly later in the game, that's probably why Molden didn't play the full close to 100% of the snaps. And I was actually surprised to see that R.J. Mickens had basically leapfrogged Tony Jefferson. So right now, Derwin James had said that it's a low ankle sprain. That's the preliminary reports. That is not a 4 to 6 week injury. That's hopefully just a 1 to 2 week injury. You may have to make contingency for this current Sunday to have someone going for Derwin James, because when he was out of the game, I mean, because it was so early in the game, obviously the game was still in question. So if it wasn't that bad, he would have gone back in. But they sat him out the whole rest of the game, which leads me to believe he's going to miss at least 1, possibly 2. Elijah Molden is the first person to target. R.J. Mickens, I still wouldn't target him because I still think he will give up some of the snaps to Tony Jefferson. That's your L.A. Chargers story. Moving to Las Vegas, they were on a bye. Their team is in trouble. When they think a saving grace is to sign Tyler Lockett, who's 33-ish now, I believe, to try and help jumpstart this team. That was the big move during the bye week. I am concerned about the Raiders. I'm not concerned about playing Devin White, though. And I'm not concerned about playing Landon Roberts, because if their offense is going to be as bad as it was against the Chiefs before they went on bye, they're going to get plenty of opportunities. As will the safeties, Jeremy Chin and Isaiah Polamalu, although Polamalu plays deep safety and don't typically like safeties that are playing the percentage of snaps that he does deep. But so much gets by the first 2 levels that it does create plenty of opportunities for Polamalu to get some tackles. Right. Moving to Denver, another blowout game. They played 74 snaps on defense against Dallas, but because of the blowout, you saw several players not playing their typical snap percentages. Nick Bonito came close to some sacks, but did not get them. Second game in a row that he does not get sacks, but we're not worried about Nick Bonito, nor are we worried about Jonathan Cooper. We continue to play those guys. In the secondary, Patrick Surtain got injured. Bad news for them. What was interesting, though, is Chris Abrams-Drain, the second-year player out of Missouri, played 49% of the snaps. He was actually the person that came in to replace Surtain, as Surtain basically went out around the halftime mark. Okay, so you had Jaquan McMillan playing 62% of the snaps. Jahdae Barron, who did get an interception, but only played 20% of the snaps. Riley Moss, 100% of the snaps, becomes your top corner. What's interesting about Riley Moss, if Surtain's out a few weeks, which this pectoral strain they're talking about doesn't sound like it's season ending, but it does sound like he will miss several weeks. Riley Moss becomes the number 1, and all of a sudden he maybe gets targeted less, and Chris Abrams-Drain is the one that gets targeted more. Just something to keep an eye on. Dre Greenlaw will be back from suspension, should move into the starting lineup next to Alex Singleton among the interior linebackers. The big question that because of his suspension we had to wait another week to find out is, does Greenlaw play 100% of the snaps, or does he pull a Justin Sterner and play somewhere between 65 and 85% of the snaps? If he'd have been able to play this last week, we might have a clearer signal. Despite the blowout, I think we'd still have a clearer signal, but we don't know that right now. So while Greenlaw is expected to move into the starting lineup, you're taking a bit of a risk assuming that he would play 100% of the snaps, even though they gave him that big contract, they gave him the big dollars. That's what we expected when the season started, but he missed a lot of time. In his first game back, they eased him back in. He only played the first half. He had only played 27 snaps in that first game back. Does he only get another half again? Does he get 3/4 of a game? Does he really theoretically get a whole game but only play 75% of the snaps and they take him out and leave Singleton in as the one true linebacker? That is all to be determined. Now, what would be really interesting to see is, does Greenlaw stay in the field passing situation and Alex Singleton be the one to come out? Maybe not in this first week, but Singleton isn't necessarily known as a great pass coverage linebacker. So, Singleton owners, be careful and watch for that as well. Okay, that wraps up the AFC, folks. Let's move to the NFC. And we'll start with the Dallas Cowboys, who played 67 snaps against Denver. And that was a blowout game. And I need some water, so hold on. All right. Starting on the edge position, Donovan Izruko, the rookie out of Boston College, played 51% of the snaps. His best game as a pro so far, but it was only 51% of the snaps. The Cowboys used 6 defensive ends this past week. Sam Williams, who was someone early in the year, and a lot of people rushed to the waiver wire after he had a great week 1, and we said, don't spend the fab dollars. Unfortunately, a lot of people did. He only played 27% of the snaps. Jadeveon Clowney played more than him, or Sean Nealon played more than him. So Sam Williams is someone that if you need a bench spot, you can let him go. Moving to the linebacker position, Kenneth Murray played 100% of the snaps. Now, that would have been something if Kyler Murray played 100% of the snaps at linebacker for the Cowboys. That'd be a whole different show and story. But it was Kenneth Murray who played 100% of the snaps. Shamar James, once again, played 95% of the snaps as the number 2 linebacker. Lufau was in the 15% range. So Lufau, you should have gotten rid of a long time ago, as we've talked about. Jack Sanborn was ruled out on Saturday, surprisingly, with a groin injury, if I'm remembering correctly. That meant there was no challenge to Shamar James in that second linebacker role. We know Shamar James has been very productive as he's been playing in this role. But remember, the Cowboys got blown out. The Broncos' offense tore them apart. So while James might be generating stats, is he really playing that effectively from an NFL situation? We know Kenneth Murray isn't, even though he continues to get the 100% of the snaps and wears the green dot. But is the same thing really happening with Shamar James? Not to mention that we're a week closer to Marvian Overshown coming back from injured reserve. And everything seems to be going really well based on reports as his 21-day window was open last week. So be high on Shamar James, but be careful. Moving to the secondary, Donovan Wilson was out, starting with the safety position. Wanye Thomas was out with migraine. Malik Hooker on IR. They were down to Marquise Bell and undrafted free agent Elijah Clark. Marquise Bell played 100% of the snaps, and as we talked about last week, Marquise Bell was a safety coming out of the University of Florida, who a couple of years ago Zimmer tried to make into a linebacker, but he was just too lightweight. So in the new regime, he has been moved back to safety. So he was one of the starters. Elijah Clark, the undrafted free agent, was out of position quite a bit, and then got injured. He only played about 52% of the snaps. And then it became a hodgepodge with some of the cornerbacks along with Marquise Bell. We're staying away from all these Cowboy safeties. If Donovan Wilson does come back, and he was listed with 2 injuries, by the way, but if he does come back, he is kind of risky. He's someone that you maybe get 5 or 6 tackles from on a recurring basis. And while he's had a couple of games close to the box, he's also played a decent amount deep as well. So stay away from all these Cowboy safeties right now, folks, is the recommendation. Now, it was also reported that, and continues to be reported, that Jerry Jones is looking to target for defensive help. And it was also reported that, shockingly, he's not looking for edge help. The fact that they're playing 6 edges / defensive ends, and they're not really getting a ton of productivity or stats or sacks, whatever you want to call it, out of any of these guys. The word is he's looking for help on the second level, which would be linebacker, or on the third level, which would be in the secondary. And the way the cornerbacks have been injured and struggling, and the same for the safeties, that is understandable. No mention of defensive tackles. I think Jerry is going to make a trade to save face to a certain degree coming out of the Micah Parsons trade. Because, yes, they got Kenny Clark, but still they're getting run on quite a bit. It was nice to see R.J. Harvey, for those R.J. Harvey owners, run for a 40-yard touchdown. It was nice to see J.K. Dobbins run for over 100 yards again this week against the Dallas Cowboys. So how much is Kenny Clark by himself really helping that defense? Not a whole lot. They need more reinforcements. Watch the trades very carefully, because if you are relying on some of these folks like a Murray, like a James, like a Donovan Wilson, etc., they could be displaced. Moving to the Giants, who played 59 snaps against Philadelphia. The leading snap count person was Abdul Carter on the edge, and this is edge specific, with 83%. Brian Burns, 64%. Kayvon Thibodeau, 63%. It was also reported today that Kayvon Thibodeau is not going to be traded by the Giants. At least that's what they're telling prospective suitors. Is that to drive up the price? Potentially. But they did pick up his option for next year, which had slipped my mind in previous discussions on Thibodeau, by the way. So they did pick up his 5th-year option. So he can be a member of the Giants next year at that 5th-year rate. So now that Thibodeau is someone I would be chasing anyway, even if he got traded into where he could have a chance to play 75 or 80% of the snaps. Abdul Carter, according to PFF, once again, shout out to PFF, his pass rush grades continue to improve. We're starting to see the Abdul Carter, who was drafted so high and thought to be one of the top players in this past year's NFL draft. We warned folks about Brian Burns, and we warned about that ankle injury he suffered late the previous week. I think that's part of the reason his snap count was only at 64%, and I think it's part of the reason we didn't maybe get the stats we were hoping for out of Brian Burns, particularly compared to what we had seen in previous weeks. Dexter Lawrence, also known as Sexy Dexy, played 71% of the snaps. You could look at his stat count, folks. Still not the Sexy Dexy we were hoping for this year for those that drafted him as a number 1 defensive tackle. At the linebacker position, Okereke played 100% of the snaps, or as my son likes to call him, Okereke, but no, it is Okereke, 100% of the snaps. Muasau is all the way up to 87%. So Muasau continues to play that old Micah McFadden role. Of course, McFadden was put on injury reserve much earlier this year. And as long as he's in that role and in deep leagues and playing 80% of the snaps, you can play him as a number 4 type of linebacker, maybe a number 5, definitely a number 5, but maybe even a number 4 type of linebacker in your lineups. So that's where we are with the Giants linebackers. Moving to the safety position, Jevon Holland was out. Dane Belton played 98% of the snaps. 48% of those snaps were close to the line of scrimmage, and I defined close to the line of scrimmage earlier in the show. If Holland continues to be out, Dane Belton is someone I'm very comfortable playing, and if I remember correctly, he had 7 total tackles. He also, if you look back at his stats last year, did get involved with some interceptions and some fumbles and so forth. So Belton is someone I could feel comfortable playing if Holland is out, particularly with him playing more close to the line of scrimmage when he's in, which also hurts Tyler Nubin. That's the other side of that coin. While Holland is out, Nubin tends to play a little bit more deep. Paulson Adebo was out at cornerback. I know a lot of you are using him as a number 1 cornerback. He was out. In his place, Deonte Banks started. Then Cardale Flott, who had been starting on the other side from LSU as a side note. Cardale Flott got a concussion during the game. He was replaced by Corey Black, who was basically a practice squad call-up. Corey Black got absolutely abused. The reason I'm bringing all that up is Drew Phillips, the slot cornerback for the Giants, only played 53% of the snaps. So it's clear they don't see Drew Phillips as an outside cornerback right now. They'd rather play a basically a practice squad call-up in Corey Black. Deontay Banks, a first-round flop outside before they put Drew Phillips out there. Drew Phillips is a slot cornerback, 53% of the snaps, as I mentioned this week. If he's not going to get a lot of playing time, once again, very important, you're looking for teams that are playing a lot of three wide to give that third cornerback, that slot cornerback, an opportunity to be on the field. If the Giants aren't playing that kind of team, which the Eagles are not when they play a lot of three wide, you end up with 53% of the snaps from Drew Phillips and not the kind of IDP stats we're hoping for. Speaking of Philadelphia, let's move to Philadelphia. And once again, this was a blowout game. They only played 52 snaps on defense. But boy, there were some important takeaways. And we're going to start off with the linebacker position right away. Zach Bone only played 87%. Of course, the reason is sat out late in the game because of the blowout. Nakobe Dean was all the way up to 64%. We've been talking about this. And if you go back and listen to any of our early shows, we talked about our fear that when Nakobe Dean came back, that because they were having struggles with pressure from the edges, that Jihad Campbell would play more on the edge. Well, Jihad Campbell only played 40% of the snaps in this game, and on top of that 40%, 38% of that 40% he played on the edge. As a result, his tackle efficiency was very poor. He didn't give us the IDP stats we wanted and needed, he being Jihad Campbell. So going forward, I think you're going to start seeing Zach Bond. Well, shouldn't say start seeing Zach Bond continue to be at about 100%, but you start seeing Nakobe Dean inch up into that 80%, 85% range. You can start, in my opinion, start playing Nakobe Dean now if you've been waiting. This is Ricky's crystal ball. This is my call. You can disagree. Don't trust me. You can ask other IDP analysts. But right now, Nakobe Dean is someone I think you can start putting into your lineup. Expect 80%. The reason why? Listen to the edge players for the Eagles this past week. Jalen Hunt played 71%. Okay. And, he's continuing to improve. He's not doing what we were hoping for early in the year, but he's continuing to improve. Josh Uche was their second edge player. Josh Uche, okay, who bounced around waivers, got traded for a 7th-round pick or a 6th-round pick at one point. He played 60% of snaps. Patrick Johnson, another one who's bounced around on waivers, left the Eagles, signed with somebody else. The Eagles picked him back up, had a good preseason. They kept him. He was at 50%. Those are your edge players right now. Zadarius Smith, remember, retired after they signed him. Nolan Smith is on IR. They're still not getting that pass rush. I expect them to continue to try and ramp up Jihad Campbell on the outside, continue to ramp him and get him ready to be a productive edge player as they get closer to the playoffs. Nakobe Dean, I think you can start playing him at the linebacker position. Okay? I would refund y'all money if that doesn't work out, but y'all aren't paying me to do this. So there you go. Jalen Carter played 82 or 83% of the snaps. He continues to play an amazing amount of snaps. Actually got a sack, which was great. Jordan Davis and Moro Ojimo were in the low 50% snap count range. Once again, this big game became a blowout, so that also impacted their stats a little bit as well. Moving on to Washington, another blowout game late in the fourth quarter where Kansas City just took over completely in the second half after a close game at halftime. Washington played a nice 69 snaps against Kansas City. Jacob Martin was the number one edge player in terms of snaps with 68% of the snaps. And that was either the fourth or fifth week in a row that he's had a sack. He's not known for being a tackler, but with him playing those percentage of snaps, along with the fact that he's generating sacks in most games, and he is a hustler type, for lack of a better term, which is going to lead to a few tackles at least now. You can play Jacob Martin now as maybe a low-end 2, high-end 3 edge player, and someone I'm considering picking up on waivers. Once again, size of leagues and positional requirements, all that comes into play. But Jacob Martin is someone to target, but don't go crazy on your fab dollars spending on Jacob Martin. You had people like Preston Smith playing 30% on the edge, Von Miller 30%. Both of them are both getting close to being able to file for Social Security at this point in time. Not saying they're completely washed, but they're at their age, they're just not going to get that kind of snap count. So what happened? And if you listen to the Start Sit show, and another reason I encourage you guys to join us on Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central, I brought up the fact that I was concerned that with the injuries to Dorrance Armstrong, Dietrich Wise, Jean Baptiste, that Frankie Louvu, they were going to have to move him to more of an edge role. And what happened? Frankie Louvu, while he played 88% of the snaps, played nearly 50% of those snaps on the edge. And I apologize, I don't remember the exact number, but it was a significant amount of snaps on the edge. Jordan McGee, who I told people could be a sneaky pickup on the Start Sit show, and he ended up playing 84% of the snaps. He had a sack, but I believe it was taken away or awarded to someone else. I can't quite remember what happened there. So he didn't get credit for that sack, but he was close to a sack. And he's also more speedy, and the Commanders talked about wanting to get more speed on the field in defense. I do not think Jordan McGee is going away. Now, I was worried that Bobby Wagner would come off the field potentially on certain passing down situations. That did not happen. So he played 100% of the snaps. But I expect Wagner and McGee to be your two linebackers. Louvu playing a lot more on the edge, particularly in pass rushing situations. So a lot of second and third downs, I think Louvu is going to be on the edge. And unless the Commanders do some heavy duty trading in here as we get closer to the trade deadline on November 4th, as I talked about earlier, and pick up someone else. But right now, that is the way things are looking. Louvu only played a few snaps as a box linebacker. So if you acquired Louvu in a trade recently, and I know someone who did, risky to play him, folks. Okay, the safety position, Quan Martin played 100% of the snaps. Jeremy Reeves and Darnell Savage had a little bit of rotation going on, along with also Tyler Owens. So Reeves played 54% of the snaps, Savage played 26%, Tyler Owens played in the 30% range. So now part of Owens getting in the game was a little bit of a blowout as well, so keep that in mind. But you had this Reeves-Savage platoon, and remember, I talked about it way back when Savage was signed, and they talked about they envisioned a role for Savage. That was after Will Harris got hurt and got put on IR. Is this a slow transitioning, or even if it's not a slow transitioning, if they're going to be rotating, you can't play Reeves, you can't play Savage. I'd be very comfortable, particularly definitely in shallow leagues, but even in deeper leagues, dropping Jeremy Reeves for someone else, for those that picked him up thinking he was going to be the next Will Harris, which was the previous Jeremy Chin. Just not going to happen, folks. So that is the news for the 49ers. Moving on to the NFC North and the Chicago Bears. They played 62 snaps against the Baltimore Ravens. It was the TJ Edwards and Terrell Edmonds basically playing all the snaps at linebacker, at the two key linebacker positions. Edmonds finally had a little bit of a down game compared to what he had been giving us, but I'm not going to let that one game slow me down in terms of playing Terrell Edmonds and feeling so good about him moving from drafted as a number 4 linebacker to now being a number 2 linebacker. With injuries, Dominique Robinson went out with an injury. Austin Booker was not yet activated from injured reserve, which, by the way, happened today on Tuesday, October 28th. So Dayo Odeyingbo played 92% of the snaps. Montez Sweat was all the way up to 81%. With Austin Booker coming back from IR, I think that will curtail some of those snap counts. The Bears don't want Dayo playing 92%. They don't want Sweat playing 81%. At least that's what their past history shows. Probably want them in the low 70% range. Some of these increased snaps for both of them has led to a little bit more increased productivity, like we talked about with Montez Sweat in last week's show, where he had 4 tackles and a sack. So maybe dial back your expectations a little bit, particularly on Montez Sweat. But in deeper leagues, I think you still play Montez Sweat as a number 3 defensive end type edge. Kyler Gordon continues to frustrate the crud out of me. I'd use a different word, but I need to keep this kid friendly. He gets placed on IR going into Sunday's game. Nick McLeod becomes the cornerback. that's taken his place. However, but Nick McLeod is no Kyler Gordon. He's no Alontae Taylor. I referenced the Saints cornerback because of how Dennis Allen, who's the defensive coordinator for the Bears, was the Saints defensive coordinator, deployed Alontae Taylor in a role that made that slot cornerback position so valuable for us. Kyler Gordon can carry that out. Nick McLeod cannot, folks. So we're not picking up McLeod. If you have IR spots, put Gordon on IR, and maybe you get him for the stretch run in the playoffs. If he's out for 4 weeks, this was a hamstring type of injury again, is what I understand. So if that's the case, hopefully we get him back. If you don't have an IR slot, I think you can drop him and then just try and pick him up maybe a week before he's due to come back. I'm still bullish on him in this defensive scheme that Dennis Allen has, but don't waste a roster spot if you don't have an IR slot to put him in. That's all we have to talk about the Bears, other than Shamar Turner, the rookie, being placed on IR as well, out for the season, the knee injury. Detroit was on bye. They did start the 21-day window for Malcolm Rodriguez. Ricky, why are you calling out Malcolm Rodriguez in the 21-day window? It's because I have a fear that the Lions do a little bit more rotating at linebacker, and that risks some snaps for Anzalone and Campbell and even Derek Barnes, because they do like him some Malcolm Rodriguez. I don't know if he'll be activated for this Sunday, and if he is, probably just gets indoctrinated with special teams. But I do worry about rotations. Just keep that in mind when Rodriguez is fully active after he's back at least a game, and you making selections for your starting lineup. Hopefully, most of the secondary will be back. Terry Arnold is supposed to be practicing and hopefully to play. Brian Branch will be back from suspension. Kirby Joseph will have had an extra week to rest and rehab his knee. Hopefully, we'll see all those guys back, even Avante Maddox as well. And, of course, DJ Reed will still be on injured reserve. But hopefully we'll get all of those folks back. Okay, moving to Green Bay, who played 63 snaps against Pittsburgh. Micah Parsons, Rashawn Gary had a sack party in that game against Aaron Rodgers. So they both played extremely well and delivered for our IDP teams. Moving to the secondary, Evan Williams played only 78% of the snaps. Second week in a row, we're in that sub 80% range roughly. Just when we thought we had things figured out, it looked like it was Keyshawn Nixon and Nate Hobbs at outside cornerbacks, Javon Bullard playing the slot, Evan Williams and Xavier McKinney as your two safeties. But no. Nate Hobbs only played 4% of the snaps. Carrington Valentine moved into the starting lineup. Javon Bullard played the slot and alternated some with Evan Williams at the safety position. Not good. Not what we wanted to hear. So keep that in mind. If you're going to put Evan Williams into your lineup, that is a risk, folks, that he will be playing less than 80% of snaps. And remember, it's not like he plays a ton of snaps close to the line of scrimmage either. Evan Williams is a huge risk. At the linebacker position, you still have Quay Walker and Edgerrin Cooper basically playing about 100% of the snaps. Cooper's another one I know that people drafted highly. I know I traded for him in one of my favorite leagues, and I gave up a lot to get him. But right now, Quay is not getting the production, and part of it is because they don't need to have him rushing the quarterbacks because of the way that Parsons and Rashawn Gary and then some of the guys from the inside, and Devontae Wyatt returned from injury this past week, which is fantastic. So they're just not having to do that. So it's clearly impacting Edgerrin Cooper's stats. And he's another one, similar to Henley, similar to Zaire Franklin. I would play Cooper over those other two, but I could see, particularly depending how deep of a lineup you have to put out there, I could see other people going into your lineups before Edgerrin Cooper right now, folks. All right, that's Green Bay. Let's go to Minnesota, who played 72 snaps against the LA Chargers. Of course, Andrew Van Ginkel was out once again with that neck injury. He was limited in practice going into the game. It was a Thursday night game on top of that. So I'm expecting him to return this coming week. That is my guess. But if he is out, Dallas Turner plays 74% of the snaps. Now, Dallas Turner is not giving us the type of productivity in sacks. His PFF grades are not great from a pass rush perspective. So don't expect a ton of big plays in particular. but at least he's getting a decent snap count that makes him worth the risk of playing him where you have to play edge players. At defensive tackle, I called it out last week, but want to mention again, Javon Hargrave, all the way down to 31% of the snaps this week. There's 4 interior defensive linemen. Jonathan Allen, Jalen Redmond, Levi Drake Rodriguez. I am shocked I remembered all 3 of those off the top of my head, but all 3 of those played more than Javon Hargrave this past week. And so if you're hoping for Hargrave to make a comeback, give you the type of sacks, as I talked about last week, it is time to cut bait on Javon Hargrave. Move on, folks. At the linebacker position, big news for the Vikings. Blake Cashman returns, plays 100% of the snaps. Eric Wilson was the second linebacker, not Ivan Pace. We expected things to return back to it was before, where Wilson had moved into Cashman's role. Cashman takes Wilson's role. Wilson goes back to the bench. Pace stays as the number 2 linebacker. That did not happen. Wilson became the number 2 linebacker, played 82% of the snaps. Ivan Pace played 24% of the snaps. I think we can let Ivan Pace go. I know there's a lot of people that love Ivan Pace, the undrafted free agent out of Cincinnati, and I purposely say that to remind people he was an undrafted free agent. When he gets a decent amount of playing time, he is hyper efficient from a tackle perspective, but he's not quite the NFL player that the Vikings would like. So he's now down to the number 3 position at linebacker. And we know that the number 2 position at linebacker for the Vikings, even though Wilson played 82% this past week, sometimes we see that dipping into the 70s and 60s. So still risky to play Eric Wilson, but certainly not going to play Ivan Pace. And for those that have been having a hard time letting Ivan Pace go, I think you can finally let him go, folks. All right. Josh Metellus played 100% of the snaps at safety, a lot of them close to the line of scrimmage, which was fantastic. That's what we wanted Josh Metellus. The big change, Harrison Smith, who's been the 3rd safety all year, the 36-year-old. Remember, early this year, he had this unknown illness that they really weren't talking about. Finally got activated, been playing as the number 3 safety and playing in the 30 to 40% of the snaps. All of a sudden, he moves to the number 2 safety role, starting next to Metellus from a safety position. He played 83% of the snaps. Now, remember, this became a bit of a blowout, so late in the game, he did come out some. Theo Jackson was all the way down to 47% of the snaps. Massive fall off. And remember, Theo Jackson plays a lot of his snaps deep. So Harrison Smith is on a lot of waiver wires up there. And if you were watching early in the game, in the first several drives, if you looked at the stats, he had 5 tackles and was at the top of the tackle board for the Vikings early in the game. A lot of that happened very early. He was generating the stats. Harrison Smith is someone to potentially target. He's not going to be the number 1 safety, but and he is going to play some deep. Don't forget about that. But he's someone that, with his experience, and he looks like he's back to his normal self, even at age 36. Someone as a number 3 safety, I think he can potentially play. Okay, don't go crazy on fab dollars as a side note, but with bye weeks, and if you're not happy with your safeties, and maybe you lost to Sean Elliott, and we're not sure what's going to happen in Pittsburgh, something to consider Harrison Smith. Theo Jackson, I wouldn't drop him quite yet if you're relying on him. Many people probably have at this point in time. But, okay, as I'm thinking about it some more, I think you can drop Theo Jackson if you're in need of another safety or another position. All right, that wraps up the NFC North. Let's move to the NFC South. And the Atlanta Falcons. Another blowout game. Who saw this one coming? As a side note, the Falcons had only given up 4 touchdowns from outside of week 1. They'd only given up 4 touchdowns from week 2 up to the game against Miami. So, and Tua and the Dolphins are struggling like crazy. No Tyreek Hill, no Darren Waller. So what do? They threw 4 touchdown passes against the Falcons. Falcons laid a complete egg. Don't know how to explain what exactly happened in that game. But in the 69 snaps that the Atlanta Falcons did play, James Pierce Jr., the first rounder, played 71% of the snaps. His PFF grades have not been that great, so great to see the playing time, but his pass rush win rate is not very good. That kind of snap count is good, but you want to have the good pass rush win rate. And remember, he is a rookie, and it does take rookies time, at least most rookies, not your Aiden Hutchinsons, but most rookies, to work up to where they get into the 8, 10, 12 potential sack range. Pierce just isn't close to being that. With that kind of snap count, even with that snap count, you can feel free to let Pierce go if you've been holding him. As a side note, the other rookie, Jalen Walker, who was drafted before James Pierce, was out with injury once again. Nate Landman. Now, we talked about this on the Start Sit show, how during the week, and I may have talked about it in the IDP Advice show last week as well, but the defensive coordinator came out and said that he expected to play Bertrand and a rotation of people. They signed Ronnie Harrison from the practice squad to the 53. They had Josh Woods. They talked about Jordan Fuller being activated from the IR, and that it was going to be Landman in this rotation. Well, they lied to us. Landman played all but one snap, and his stats weren't that bad. However, I saw one of the beat reporters quote Raheem Morrison saying that JT Bertrand did not do the job that they were expecting and hoping for. For a coach to call you out like that, if it's true, once again, I'm just reporting what I read from the beat reporter reporting, that is bad news for Bertrand. Don't rely on him. Don't put him on your lineup. The rotation that they talked about, I think, is going to be real. I think Bertrand will be in on obvious running downs. And outside of that, is it a Jordan Fuller? Is it a Josh Woods? Is it a DeMarco Helms, another backup safety that moves into that role? We'll have to see how that plays out. But don't play Bertrand would be my recommendation unless you're absolutely desperate, based on the comment from the defensive coordinator that they were going to do a rotation even though they didn't, and based on Raheem Morris, the head coach's comments. Not good at all. Jesse Bates played 83% of the snaps, but he did leave the game with an injury, and Jordan Fuller was the one to replace him. So that, depending on Bates' situation, that could impact who rotates in with Nate Landman if Fuller ends up playing the Bates role, or if Fuller takes a deep safety role and Watts moves into, Xavier Watts, the rookie from Notre Dame, moves into the Bates role if Bates is out. Now, Jesse Bates played over 80% of his snaps close to the line of scrimmage. Sorry for that pause there, folks. But if he's playing like that, whoever takes over his role, if he is injured and out, that could be huge, whether it be Xavier Watts or Jordan Fuller. Let's continue to watch for reports. I don't think they're going to give it away necessarily. And I do think they like the way Watts covers the deep secondary. So Jordan Fuller, a ghost from the past, if Jesse Bates is out, could suddenly be thrust into a very productive IDP position, even if he's not the best NFL safety necessarily. All righty, that's the news on the Atlanta Falcons. Let's move to the Carolina Panthers. Once again, we talked about this becoming quite the blowout game, and with that, it impacted snap counts for certain players. Starting at linebacker position, though, Trevin Wallace left the game injured. He was the starting linebacker. He was the green dot, according to reports, but he left injured. When he left injured, Christian Roseboom moved back into the green dot role that he had earlier in the year. Roseboom played 95% of the snaps. Claudin Charles came in and played 29% of the snaps. He became the number 2 linebacker when Wallace left. Depending on the severity of Wallace's injury, and if he's going to be out and you need a linebacker, Claudin Charles last year in a similar situation got thrown in and had decent productivity as a number 2 linebacker. Okay, look, I'm not taking it to the bank, folks. Do not take it to the bank and say that Ricky Rod 66 said Claudin Charles is going to be a stud. I am not saying that. I'm not saying he's going to be uber efficient / productive. But if you are desperate, Claudin Charles is someone that you can potentially pick up and maybe even play if Trevin Wallace is out. Derek Brown played only 63% of the snaps, I believe it was. Sorry, I didn't write that down. He was injured in the fourth quarter. It was reported he could have gone back in the game, but with the game being out of hand, they did not put him back in. Ashawn Robinson was in that 64% range, similar to Derek Brown as well. The leading interior defensive tackle from the snap composition was Tershawn Wharton, the former free agent out of the Kansas City Chiefs, played 77% of the snaps. But we're not chasing Wharton, folks. It's still Derek Brown. It's still a Shawn Robinson. We warned that the matchup Derek Brown had the week before. We warned you all in last week's show that don't necessarily expect that to repeat because it was a matchup driven um, results for Derek Brown. We're just not going to get the Derek Brown of 2 years ago. I don't know if it's scheme. I don't know if it's come back from injury. Whatever it is, we're just not going to see that anymore. And remember, that was quite an outlier to begin with when he had so many tackles in. So you can still have Derek Brown on your roster as a number 2 defensive tackle, but don't expect the kind of results that he gave us 2 weeks ago. Okay, sorry, I got to rambling on that one. We'll move on. They did sign Trevis Gibson today on Tuesday, October 28th, off of the 49ers practice squad from an edge position. Trevis Gibson was called up from the practice squad by the 49ers and actually had the second most snaps at defensive end for the 49ers. So the 49ers have been playing this game back and forth with Gibson on the active roster, practice squad, active roster, practice squad. Well, now they've lost him to the Panthers, and he'll be playing along with Nick Skirton and Princely Umanilian and, of course, DJ Wanham. Nick Skirton did have another sack, but it was once again more luck than what you see out of a Bonito or what you're seeing out of a TJ Watt type, things along those lines. So don't get too excited still about Nick Skirton, folks. That is my warning to you. Also, DJ Wanham is what he is. He is a volume-based producer, but certainly not a stud. And Wanham did lead that team in edge snaps this past week. Desperate situation, DJ Wanham. Nothing really to report in the secondary for Carolina. Let's go on to the New Orleans Saints, who only played 58 snaps against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. For the second week in a row, Chase Young, in his second game back, leads the edge position with 62% of the snaps. Granderson, once again, at that 60% range. Cam Jordan, once again, in that 43% range. Chris Rumph, a little bit up at 38% as the fourth defensive end / edge. Chase Young is someone to go after, folks. Now, in our top 24 show that Shawn and I did during the summer, once again, you can follow Shawn at Shawn8386. When we did our predictions for who would fall out of the top 24 at the edge position, who would move to the top 24, Chase Young was one of my projections. And in some of the comments that someone put on the show on the YouTube channel, which, once again, as a reminder, if you missed the beginning of the show, put your comments, questions, suggestions on the YouTube channel, and we will go and answer them and respond to them. Shawn and I will. But I called out Chase Young as moving to the top 24. Based on these first 2 weeks, he would have a shot at it, at least from a points per game perspective, not total points, but he's off to a tremendous start in his role. And while I've been making fun of him in the 3 years and the $51 million the Saints signed him for, and he was going to be back in a week or two, and it was after 5 weeks that he finally came back. But he's come back, and he's playing quite well. So Chase Young, when you're looking at your waiver wires from an edge perspective, is someone to consider. We're not breaking the bank on him, but if you've been disappointed in some of your edge players, he is someone to consider picking up. Okay, the linebacker position, Demario Davis played 100% of the snaps once again. Pete Werner, all the way down to 41% of the snaps. Pete Werner is droppable at this point. I just don't see any kind of situation where, as long as Brandon Staley is defensive coordinator, which there's no signs of him being let go in any way, shape, or form, that Werner is going to be the starter, particularly in dynasty leagues next year, or play enough this year, getting back into that 80, 85, 90% range, where you could feel good putting him to your lineup. Danny Stutzman and Isaiah Stallbird both played 14% of the snaps. We've talked about Stutzman in the past, talked about Stallbird last week. In fact, I made a very bold prediction. It was a foggy crystal ball, but there was this prediction that Demario Davis is potentially traded. We'll see what happens before the trade deadline. And that Stutzman and Isaiah Stallbird are used 2 starters at linebacker by about week 13 or 14 for the New Orleans Saints. That's my foggy crystal ball prediction. I'm sticking with that at this point in time. But in the deepest of leagues and dynasty leagues, consider picking up Stallbird. Most people have probably picked up Stutzman in these dynasty leagues, the deep ones in particular, but Stallbird might be out there. I actually got him in my RSO contracts league that I just joined this year. Moving on to Tampa Bay, who played 72 snaps against the Saints. Anthony Nelson stepped in for Hassan Reddick, played 63% of the snaps, and thanks to Spencer Rattler, had one hell of a game. He had a pick six, he had 2 sacks, he forced a fumble in one of those sacks. Incredible game. Now, what have we heard? What have we learned? Hopefully, if you've been following me and Shawn for all these weeks, even going back to last year as well, about some of these one-off outliers, particularly someone who has been a non-starter, someone who they re-signed, but they went out and signed someone to play over him. In this case, Hassan Reddick. We don't chase those, particularly with big fab dollars. You want to give $1 or 1% or whatever, and you can get him, great. But folks, don't chase. Remember, Hassan Reddick's going to come back, and when he does, the veteran that they signed him for $13 million in a prove-it type of contract situation. I believe it was $13 million. Don't quote me on that. But expect Reddick to move back into his role and Anthony Nelson to go back to the bench. So if Reddick misses one more game, deep league, desperate, maybe Anthony Nelson, but don't spend a lot of fab dollars on him, folks. Servatia Dennis at linebacker played 100% of the snaps. Levante David was 81%. Now, late in the game when this game became a blowout and out of reach, they took Levante David out. That's why I only played 81% of the snaps. They put Deion Jones in, who played a little bit over 20% of the snaps. And so that is what happened in that game. That's why Levante David wasn't near the 100% mark. If you've been playing Levante David, you can stick with him. But as Shawn and I have been talking about, some of the big plays, whether it be interception, fumble, sack, that have been bailing out Levante David for the most part. If you look at his tackles across the games, they haven't been that high. His age is showing. Once again, when he comes off a big game, I would encourage you to try and trade him before your league trade deadlines if you have him. At the safety position, we had Tyke Smith and Antoine Winfield basically playing 100% of the snaps. Zion McCullum played 100% at cornerback, and he had a bit of rotation once again at the other cornerback position with Benjamin Morrison, the rookie, along with Jamel Dean. Jacob Parrish continued to be your slot cornerback. Jacob Parrish did get banged up, so if you've been using him, and granted he only played in I believe it was 54% of the snaps. I was again trying to remember that off the top of my head, folks. I remember it was 50-something%. But he did get banged up too. So if you've been using him, you've got to watch the injury reports if you're planning on playing Jacob Parrish here as we move forward. That completes the NFC South. Let's move to the NFC West. Arizona was on bye. Nothing really to report from an injury perspective other than Garrett Williams was activated. No, he wasn't fully activated to the 53-man roster. I want to be clear. The 21-day window for him to practice to get him ready to be activated was started today here on Tuesday the 28th. Garrett Williams is one of those cornerbacks who, when they only have 2 cornerbacks on the field, he plays on the outside. When they go to 3 cornerback, he plays in the slot. I expect that to continue once he is activated, which makes Garrett Williams a very valuable cornerback for our IDP leagues. But where that has an impact, the people that have been relying on Dadrian Taylor-Demerson, even though he's only been playing 50-something% of the snaps roughly, he's been playing a third safety, but they without a true nickel cornerback because of all the cornerback injuries the Cardinals have had. Baker and Thompson and Taylor-Demerson were all picking up some of those snap counts, slot snaps. Okay, there you go. I told you I was in a hotel and I'm traveling and I'm tired, so I'm doing my best, folks. But anyway, I expect Taylor-Demerson to play a lot less if Garrett Williams gets activated. So if you've been relying on him because of the stats he has been generated, you're going to get burned here at some point by Taylor-Demerson. Move him to your bench. Continue to stash him for dynasty leagues, although I'm not huge on stashing safeties in dynasty leagues. But with Jalen Thompson being a free agent coming up, and the way the Cardinals like Taylor-Demerson, I expect him to move into that starting role next to Budda Baker next year. But right now, he's just strictly a stash if you want to stash a safety. Moving to the LA Rams, the news I wanted to call out that I alluded to earlier, they traded for Roger McCreary. Roger McCreary's best position is the slot. That's where Quentin Lake has been uber productive from an IDP perspective for us. The Rams, there's scuttlebutt that the Rams are trying to sign Lake to an extension because this is his last year before free agency. That hasn't happened yet. Is it a situation while Lake has been great for our IDP teams, maybe he hasn't been as great on the field for the Rams from an NFL perspective? Not sure. Are they trading for McCreary just for depth? Or are they trading for McCreary and are going to play him on the outside? Remember, too, the Rams have been rotating their cornerbacks so much, excluded Quentin Lake, who's been playing basically 100% of the snaps, is more of a safety that plays a slot, like a Jalen Petrie type. But the other cornerbacks on the outside, none of them were playing more than like 83% of the snaps, and there's been this heavy rotation. Does McCreary get worked into that? If I'm placing a bet in Vegas right now, I think that's what happens with McCreary. He becomes part of that outside cornerback rotation. However, I can see him taking a few snaps away from Lake, but Lake wouldn't necessarily go off the field. Lake might move to the other safety position next to Cam Curl, which would bump Cam Kinchins off the field a little bit more. By the way, Kinchins did get dinged up in the game before the Rams bye this past Sunday. So might Lake lose a few snaps as they try and get creative in different looks and different packages for opponents? Yeah, Lake might lose a few of those snaps in the slot to McCreary, but I don't think it's going to be a ton. So I'm betting in Vegas that Lake primarily slays at that slot position and McCreary plays on the outside, but also gives him protection. If Lake gets hurt, McCreary moves into that Quentin Lake position, which could be very, very valuable for Roger McCreary. All right. Moving to San Francisco, who played a whopping 80 snaps against Houston. So remember, I talked about the fact how Houston only played 48 snaps on defense, and that was because San Francisco's defense was on the field, couldn't get off the field, and they played 80 snaps. Making matters worse, Sam O, who I can't pronounce his last name, and you all know that. I've said that week over week. He was injured. He's not expected to be back this coming week. So, and then as I talked about earlier, when I talked about the Carolina Panthers, Travis Gibson was signed from the practice squad to the Carolina Panthers active roster. So the 49ers lose two more. So what had happened this evening? The 49ers traded for Keion White from the New England Patriots. I expect Keion White to jump in there right away and get 75% of the snaps. He'll be getting it along with the Robert Beals of the world. Bryce Huff, remember, was supposed to miss a couple of weeks, so we'll see if Bryce Huff is particularly back. But I expect Keion White to immediately jump in and get a ton of snaps. And there, of course, there's Michael Williams, the first-round rookie out of Georgia. Forgot to mention him as well. But I think Keion White is going to jump in right away and get a big number of snaps. And I just don't think he fit the New England Patriots system, how they're trying to use it. I'm a Keion White fan. Am I running out to pick him up? No, I'm not running out to pick him up. But am I watching very carefully? And if the playing time is there, and you can listen here, and we'll talk about how he's doing from a pass rush perspective and all, I'm keeping an eye on Keion White. If you have one of these watch lists that you keep for your dynasty leagues or your redraft leagues, throw Keion White on there as someone you keep an eye on and watching. As a side note, the 49ers also worked out Cleveland Farrell. As I went to recording, it wasn't reported that he was signed yet to the practice squad, but I do expect that that's what's going to happen, particularly with Travis Gibson being signed by the Panthers away from the 49ers practice squad. Moving to the linebacker position, Tatum Bethune moved into the Fred Warner role, played 100% of the snaps, and as I talked about earlier in the show, 14 combined tackles. Excellent job by Tatum Bethune. D. Winters was having an excellent game after a couple of games where he was down in the tackles, in number of tackles he had created for us. He was up there, and then in the 70-some, he played 70-some% of the snaps, and then he hurt his knee. It was reported today that it is, quote, a day-to-day injury. But when you have a knee injury and it's day-to-day and you don't go back into a game, well, that makes me a little bit nervous about playing him. But As we talked about earlier in the show with the Cleveland Browns and these weird third linebacker positions, Luke Gifford was the number 3 linebacker. Whether it was Tatum Bethune and Fred Warner as the number 1, D. Warner as the number 2, then Luke Gifford was the number 3 as that Sam/strong side linebacker. So when Winters went out, you would have thought maybe Gifford moved into that role for Winters. No, that's not what happened. Curtis Robinson is the person that moved into that role. I expect that Curtis Robinson is probably on 99.9% of available free agents across all leagues. If Winters is out for a week, Robinson has the chance to have productivity. So if you have, with 4 buys coming up this current week, I expect that Curtis Robinson is someone that, if you need someone for 1 week, that you can potentially pick up and play if D. Winters is out. I'm not worried about Luke Gifford moving to that role based on what we saw in this game. At the safety position, the 49ers may have settled on 2 starting safeties. Last week we had Jair Brown playing 100% of the snaps, and we had this rotation with Marquise Siegel, Jason Pinnock, and Malik Mustafa, who came off of IR. Well, this past week, Malik Mustafa, Jair Brown both played 100% of the snaps. So Malik Mustafa is someone that I would feel comfortable picking up and putting into my starting lineup this coming week. I'm not worried about them going back into rotation. If there's a rotation, quite frankly, I think Jair Brown would probably be the winning risk, not Malik Mustafa. So pick up Mustafa if you need a safety. Put him into your lineups, folks. At the cornerback position, Upton Stout continues to be the slot cornerback. He was back from injury after missing a week, and Chase Lucas played that role. Upton Stout returned to his normal role, played about 60% of the snaps in that game. Chase Lucas did get on the field for some snaps. He did play 26% of the snaps against Houston. But Upton Stout is the slot cornerback to have from San Francisco. Seattle was on bye. So not a whole lot to report there. Some things to watch out for. Number 1 is Derek Hall back from injury. But Derek Hall, if he comes back from injury, could have an impact to Uchenna Nwosu's snap count, DeMarcus Lawrence's, Boye Maffei's. As I talked about last week, I think Maffei is going to take the biggest hit in snap counts. Nwosu and Lawrence down a tidbit, but I do still feel good about Uchenna Nwosu as a number 2 edge position player. Shawn doesn't think quite as highly as Nwosu, but I am there, and I wanted to make sure, as I talked about earlier in the show, that I gave some of Shawn's perspectives on here. There are several that I mentioned here. I didn't necessarily call them out because Shawn and I were aligned on so many of them. This is one we differ a little bit. I'm good with Nwosu as a number 2. Shawn would see him probably more as a number 3 edge, being Nwosu when I say he. But Maffei not playing, DeMarcus Lawrence down some. At the defensive back position, Devin Witherspoon's missed a ton of time. Julian Love has missed a ton of time. We'll be watching practice reports to see if both those two come back. Both are expected to come back. If they do, Nick Emanwori, how he's going to be utilized will be really interesting. He fulfilled a lot of that Devin Witherspoon role, but we know Witherspoon's going to move back into that role. At the linebacker position, and where it applies to Manwari, we talked in our last show last week how Ernest Jones continues to be 100%, but Drake Thomas took over that second linebacker role, playing, I believe it was 92% of the snaps, if I remember correctly. Tyrese Knight, in the last 2 games, played a total of 2 snaps. 2 games ago, he played 2. Last game, he played 0. So Drake Thomas clearly leapfrogged Tyrese Knight. The question is, does Nick Emanwari take away some of the Drake Thomas snaps, particularly in passing situations? That is something we're going to watch for. Do they do some sort of very different deployment of some of the secondary folks? And is there some sort of ripple effect maybe to a Kobe Bryant? Do they trade Tariq Woolen, which is being rumored, and they move Witherspoon more to the outside? Lots of questions to watch for from the Seattle Seahawks, and lots of things for you to consider when you're thinking about who you might want to start at the linebacker, safety, and edge position for the Seahawks this coming week. It might not be as clear cut as we were thinking going into the bye, and I just wanted you all to be aware of that. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's something that could happen. Okay. I promised that concludes all 32 teams. I promised I would talk about the buys. So let me quickly go over to the buys and I accidentally closed it out, so I won't go over to the buys. Y'all can look that up online. My wife is in the hotel room over here laughing at me because I forgot and then I accidentally closed it out. I mean, so with that, y'all can look up who's on buy and know that the advice I gave you could just wait one more week on all those advice for those 4 teams. All righty. That concludes today's show, folks. And as a reminder, you can watch our Start Sit show every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central. And once again, even if you don't have a question, we have some fun. We have great engagement with our listeners, our customers, our followers, whatever you want to call them. Love those guys to death and gals. Love them all to death. They've been great to interact with. But the important thing is we're giving out all kind of last minute tidbits that we learn about. Come and listen to the show and check it out. Okay. And of course, as I talked about earlier, please give us a thumbs up if you love this show. Really appreciate that. And what that does in particular is on YouTube, it also helps with making other people aware about the show so that they can come and listen and learn as you all are as well. And hopefully maybe not your league mates because you don't want them to know all this good stuff that you all are learning. Okay, give it a thumbs up as I talked about. Subscribe to the channel as well. If you have comments, questions, suggestions, put them on the YouTube channel, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and Shawn and I will follow up on that. I'm going to apologize now. I did not get all the timestamps. And for me to get this show out for you all for early Wednesday morning, there will be no timestamps. So my apologies in advance, but I couldn't do it, particularly being in a hotel room and without all my monitors and computers. So I apologize for that. I will get it done next week. With that, we'll be back next Tuesday night to record for you to see next Wednesday morning. But in the meantime, join us Sunday morning. And on behalf of Shawn T, who you can find at Shawn8386, and on behalf of myself, Ricky Rodrigue, who you can find at RickyRod66 on X, I'm wishing you, and Shawn is also wishing you, your family, and your friends great health and happiness. Be kind to one another, and take care, and we will see you at the next show. Bye, everybody.